Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. Today's piece is entitled Classic Book, The Genocide of the Black Brazilian by Abdias Nascimento, re-released. Originally released in 1978, the title was The Activist's Attempt to Expose the Myth of Racial Democracy Outside of Brazil. Needless to say, this is an important work for any of us who have spent time studying and trying to figure out this whole question of race in Brazil. This is one of those books that, everybody should have in their collection. I've talked a lot about this. Abdias Nascimento, he was born in 1914. He died in 2011. It was funny, ironic. He actually died just shortly after Barack Obama made his first trip to Brazil, and I think it was in 2011. There's a lot I could say about him. He was, the first, I'll say, Black figure that I can remember learning about that really got me into understanding the experiences of what they call Afro-Descendentes, people of African descent in Brazil. He was one of the few Black authors that you could find whose work had been translated into English. So, everything that I could find by him, I snatched it up. I've said this often in terms of modern day Black leaders, he's perhaps the closest thing to a Malcolm or Martin that Black Brazil ever had. As I said, he lived to be 97, and his accomplishments and some of the things that he was responsible for, it's just, he had an incredible resume, we could say. So besides the first two books that I read by him, when I was sufficient enough to read Portuguese regularly, I had to pick up a few more of his pieces that had not been translated into English. So that's where this book comes in. In Portuguese, I believe it's like O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro. So the book was re-released. I think, this article is from 2017, so I'm going to say it was probably released around that time. I can, look that up again. Not sure exactly, but it's a classic. It's a book that, if you want to understand the racial situation in Brazil, it's a must-have. So without further ado, I want to get right into this article. So this is the edition of the book that I had. Look at maybe this is a better picture. The one on the left, I had the original copy. I found it somewhere at some sebo in Brazil. A sebo is like one of these used stores where you can go and buy like old, vinyl albums or old books. Sometimes they sell just all types of stuff, just used stuff that you can go by and just buy. Sometimes, you got clothing and stuff in there. Every time I would go to Brazil, before moving there, whatever city or state that I was in, I would always make sure to visit a local sebo, because it was just, there were things in there that I could always just add to my collection and bring back to the United States. So usually I was on the hunt for books and vinyl albums. Oftentimes I also like to get, Brazilian magazines, because they just give you a feel of what the country was like in the particular area that era, I'll say, that you're searching for. So again, this is O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro. This is the book that I have, the version that I was able to buy. This is, of course, Abdias Nascimento again, born in 1914. He died in 2011 at the age of 97. And this was the reissued version, O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro, Abdias Nascimento. Sometimes you find the D-O word in between. Some people just call him Abdias Nascimento. Other people is Abdias do Nascimento. So anyway, let me get directly into this. Again, if you're someone who's able to read, Portuguese, you want to understand what's going on with Brazil. Yeah, definitely a book to add to your collection. Almost anything by Abdias Nascimento is necessary reading. So anyway, again, to remind you that I changed the name of this blog, I don't know, maybe 2 to 3 years ago. It was formerly known as Black Women of Brazil. I felt the need to change that name to Black Brazil Today. So anyway, this is an article from January of 2017. So in a brief bio I published several weeks ago, again, this is from 2017, I described how I happened to get into studies of the situation of Afro-Brazilians. It is a question that I am frequently asked, or I have been frequently asked over the years. In responding to the question, I always say that it was first due to the 2,000-page encyclopedia entitled Africana, the Encyclopedia of the African and African American Experience. This reference book introduced me to a number of important Afro-Brazilian historical figures, as well as presenting a history of slavery, cultural practices, and a thorough summary of how Black Brazilians came to be in the position they are today in Brazilian society. So just a few personalities that you'll find in this encyclopedia, and there are many. This is actually one of the reasons that I got into Brazil, because when you flip through this encyclopedia, I know the later editions of Africana, they divided the book into like several different books. When I originally bought it, it was like one big encyclopedia with like 2,000 pages in it. I saw later editions came out. It had they divided the 2,000-page original book into several different, I don't know if maybe there's 10 in the collection. But when I bought that book, I was just amazed at how much was in there about, Black Brazilians. Not only was I led to Abdias Nascimento, there was a lengthy piece about him in that encyclopedia. You had people like Benedito da Silva, a longtime politician from a Rio slum. You had musical legends like Cartola, Pixinguinha. There's pieces in there about Gilberto Gil, Jorge Ben. There's things in there about the candomblé religion in Brazil. It talked about capoeira. It talked about the cultural history of samba. So I got this book, and it just, out of all the things that caught my attention in that book, it was the page after page that I just found about the situation in Brazil. And it made me question, I was someone who I considered myself to be somewhat of a Pan-Africanist, because I was curious to know about the situation of Black people all over the world, because, you grow up in the United States, and obviously they'll feed you some of that history and you'll discover some on your own search. But then you come to find out, well, there are Black populations throughout the Americas that have similar but slightly different experiences, coming from a slave past, going through abolition, and then what is the overall social condition of these populations. And so Brazil is something that just caught my eye. And, just Christmas Eve of 1999, this led me on this journey to even here it is almost 22, 23 years later, and I'm still digging, still learning. So after having bought Africana, the Encyclopedia of the African and African American Experience, there was a local bookstore in Detroit called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and hanging out in, that's where I bought the Africana Encyclopedia. That bookstore is closed now. It's a shame. It's one of the best cultural centers in Detroit, or it was. And in that same bookstore, after I had spent time reading this material on Brazil, Black culture in Brazil, and different Afro-Brazilian personalities, I went to that same bookstore and I happened to find these two books: Abdias Nascimento and his wife Elisa Larkin Nascimento, Africans in Brazil, a Pan-African Perspective, and Brazil, Mixture or Massacre, Essays in the Genocide of a Black People. So Nascimento spoke frequently about what he considered to be the genocide of Afro-Brazilians. So anyway, one of the figures that really captivated me was the activist, professor, painter, poet, playwright, actor, and politician Abdias Nascimento. After reading the biography of this man that Africana proclaimed, quote unquote, the most complete African intellectual of the 20th century, I wanted to know more. That in itself should tell you why and how important this man must have been. I mean, just consider all of the African descendant and African intellectuals just of the 20th century. I mean, obviously people think of W.E.B. Du Bois. People could talk about Frantz Fanon. You could go into talk about John Henry Clark. You can talk about some of the great African thinkers. I mean, think of Cheikh Anta Diop. So many people that could be named, and yet you get a Black Brazilian man who's considered by this encyclopedia as the most complete African intellectual of the 20th century. And that's because look at all the things that he was talented at. He was an activist, a professor, painter, poet, playwright, actor, and politician. He created this theater group in Brazil, I believe in Rio in like 1944. It was called TEN. Basically, if you translated the Teatro Experimental Negro, translated as the Black Experimental Theater, he came up with this theater group to address the lack of Black participation on, theater stages throughout Brazil. He had seen some play where he saw a white actor playing a Black character in blackface. And back in those days, it was like the only Black people you would find in a Brazilian theater were the ones who were sweeping the stage after the theater piece. So that's where he came up with the idea of creating this theater group. So this just a very well-rounded intellectual. Abdias Nascimento is one of those guys that you would think like, well, Brazil needs to do a biopic about him. I think there's enough material about his life that you could probably, create a biopic about him. So anyway, let me see, where was I at? Okay, they proclaimed him the most complete African intellectual of the 20th century. So after all of that, I wanted to know more. A few weeks after having bought Africana, I found 2 books written by Nascimento, both in English. The first was Africans in Brazil, a Pan-African perspective, and the second was Brazil, Mixture or Massacre, Essays in the Genocide of a Black People. Both of these books blew me away because up to that point that I had bought Africana, I knew nothing about the history of African descendants in Brazil. By that time, the only Black person I knew from Brazil was Pelé, or who Americans call Pele. Of course, Pele passed away. I think it was the end of December. Just, it's coming up on a month now that the great Pele passed away. But even knowing Pele as a child, I had no idea, of this vast population of African descendants in Brazil until I came across the work of again, the Africana Encyclopedia, as well as the works of Abdias Nascimento. So as an African-American, I was simply captivated by the history of a group, Afro-Brazilians, that had a history that was so similar yet different from that of African-Americans. Up to that point in my life, I had no desire to try to learn a new language. Although I had taken Spanish and French in school, I lacked that spark that made me really want to take learning a new language seriously. After discovering the history of Afro-Brazil and Abdias Nascimento, I finally had a purpose to take on learning a foreign language, which was Portuguese, which is spoken in Brazil and a few other countries around the world. Right around that time, I really started to get into the finding of information on the internet. And with my newfound passion, I wanted to find everything I could on Black Brazil. That's another thing that I remember. Around the time that I started digging into Brazil was right around the time that I really started getting into, surfing the internet. I would soon get a computer. I started off with, I think I had something called web TV. You connected to your television and you had access to the internet. And so this all happened right around the same time, around the time I really got into the internet, and then I discovered Brazil. And then you put internet and this new discovery together. And, every day I'm looking for something new on Brazil. At the time, I couldn't read Portuguese, so I'm just scouring the internet to find as much as I can in English. I would literally spend hours on the internet seeking whatever I could about Brazil in English. But after a few months and hundreds of hours of searching for information, I grew frustrated at using keywords and pulling up hundreds of articles, many in English, but far more in Portuguese. At that time, when I was still a beginner learning Portuguese, I used several online translation programs to help me get the gist of the articles in Portuguese. But after about 6 months of Portuguese lesson books and CDs, I could finally read Portuguese well enough to get through some articles online. Again, this is the version of the book that I had, O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro, Processo de Racismo Mascarado, right? Masked racism, which is really, that explains much of how people understand how racism functions in Brazil. It's kind of masked. It's like, in some ways it's veiled, and sometimes in some ways it's very much obvious. I think both facets of racism exist in Brazil. So as soon as I began my yearly travels to Brazil, I began picking up as many titles on race in that country as I could find. I started with the classics by Carl Degler and Thomas Skidmore, and eventually delved into titles by Kim Butler, Anthony Marks, John Burdick, Rebecca Reichman, Michael Hanchard, and many others as I continued to develop my knowledge of Portuguese. Then one day at a library, I came across a copy of Nascimento's O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro, Processo de Racismo Mascarado, which translates as The Genocide of the Black Brazilian, Process of a Masked Racism. Similar to the two Nascimento titles I had read previously, I couldn't put the book down. Although my Portuguese proficiency still didn't allow me to read it as fast as the first two titles in English. Just a few of the chapter titles reveal why. If you translate some of the chapters in the Genocídio book, and you translate it into English, a few of these chapters would be titled Slavery, the Myth of the Benevolent Master. That's to say that Brazil created this idea that slavery was softer in Brazil than it was in other countries. And when you dig into slavery in Brazil, you know that that's not true. That's been debunked thoroughly. You have sexual exploitation of the African woman. I think that speaks for itself. Another one called Racial Discussion Prohibited, which speaks on the fact that one of the main reasons that most of us didn't know that Brazil has such a problem with racism is because the conversation was actually prohibited. There was like part of a law in Brazil where you could actually get in serious trouble if you talked about racism publicly in Brazil, because the official governmental stance was, we don't have racism here. Another translated title would be International Racial Image and the Whitening of the Culture, another strategy of genocide. And then to learn the great lengths that the Brazilian government went to try to silence Nascimento's presentation in Nigeria were simply unbelievable. The myth of Brazil's famed racial democracy had been constructed and basically held in place for about 40 years, and the military government of the time would do all it would take to maintain this image outside of the Brazilian borders. Now, I mentioned Nigeria there. I'm gonna get it. I think there's more about this story as we go on, but Nascimento and a couple of other Brazilians participated in this. Every year there was like the Nigerian World Arts Festival. If I'm not mistaken, Gilberto Gil went, Caetano Veloso went. I'm not sure if Jorge Ben went, but these are some of the top musicians in Brazil. And Nascimento went there, and he went there specifically to address an international gathering of African descendants to denounce what he saw as the vicious racism in Brazil. And they tried to make sure that he was not allowed to speak during that festival. As I'm saying, I think there's more about this as I go on, but let me continue. What has been great to see is that at the time that Nascimento released this book, militancy among Afro-Brazilians denouncing the bogus claim that Brazil had no racial problems was limited to a rather small group of activists and the then beginnings of the Movimento Negro, which was officially organized in the same year that the Genocide book was released in 1978. So just in case if you've never heard of it, the Movimento Negro. So then let me discuss this just for a minute. You can't really get into Black Brazilian politics without discussing what's called the Movimento Negro. Movimento Negro, it just means the Black movement, the Black rights movement, you could say. It is a loose, it's an umbrella term for just numerous organizations across Brazil that represents the interests of the Black Brazilian population. It's not just one it's an umbrella term for a bunch of organizations all under the same, let's say, flag issues that affect the Black community in Brazil. So it was a famous gathering of Black activists in Sao Paulo in 1978, where I think it was July 7th, 1978, on the steps of the municipal theater in Sao Paulo, where just numerous activists came together to announce that the Black population was no longer going to just passively accept the acts of racism and racist violence that they were subjected to on a daily basis, basically since the arrival of Africans in the country that would become Brazil. So this article is from 2014, and I have, as I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race, there's numerous articles on, probably almost every article, or 50 to 75% is going to say something about the Movimento Negro, because everything that's going on politically in terms of the Black population is something that the Movimento Negro will be involved in. So when you look and you think, okay, well, what is the struggle in Brazil, and who represents that struggle? Who is the one that's bringing the demands of the Black population to the Brazilian society as well as its government? And that's where you would say the Movimento Negro. When we, in comparison, like the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in the United States, that was also formed by a number of different organizations. Later, after the more passive wing of the struggle for Black rights in the United States, people were just kind of frustrated with the movement of the civil rights activists. They felt that they were being a little bit too more passive when they wanted to take a turn toward more militancy. That's when the Black Power movement came about. So in comparison, as the title says, the Movimento Negro, the movement that came up out of that, was influenced by movements in the United States and Africa, because around the same time, going back to 50s and 60s, you had decolonization movements going on over in Africa. So there was influence from the U.S. civil rights movements, its Black Power movements, as well as the anti-colonial struggle in Africa that influenced the development of the collective of the Movimento Negro, which emerged in 1978 in the fight for racial equality. So this is one of the articles I put up in 2014. This is your symbol of the Movimento Negro. You have all types of protests and displays and demonstrations. It should be pointed out that this is not Brazil's first organized movement against oppression. That goes back to the 1930s with an organization called the Frente Negra Brasileira, meaning the Brazilian Black Front, right? This goes back to the 30s. And this was a very important organization in the struggle for Afro-Brazilian rights. The organization, I think it existed for maybe about 6 years before it was shut down because of that dictatorship that would arise around that time. So there's been a number of books, whether you read Portuguese or not, there are a number of good books out there that talk about the history of Brazil's Black movement. This is by no means, an exhaustive list of books. If you went to Amazon.com, you would find just plenty of books about, the Movimento Negro and the overall Black struggle in Brazil. Just a few books that I would have in my collection that are talking about like the movement of Afro-Brazilians. You have the Afro-Brazilian Organization Directory, a reference guide to Black organizations in Brazil by Sean Lindsay. Orpheus and Power, the Movimento Negro of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, 1945 to 1988. And you have the Unified Black Movement in Brazil, 78 to 2002 by David Coben. These are just a few books. There are many more that I could add to that, but those are some of the ones that got me into understanding what the struggle was about in Brazil and how they went about it. This is the famous gathering on the steps of the municipal theater in Sao Paulo. This is considered the coming together of various organizations that supported the struggle and the demands of the Black population in Brazil. So this is from that day. The Movimento Negro came together under the military dictatorship that held Brazil's government from 1964 to 1985. So in 1978, 14 years after the military took over power in Brazil, the Movimento Negro came to fruition. Just like we've heard about this coming from the United States, this intelligence that's keeping its eye on Black leadership, same thing happened there. And you see Brazil's own intelligence agencies. Okay, this picture is saying, well, this is my subtitle, says, during the years of the military dictatorship, the Movimento Negro Unificado, which is the full name, the MNU, which means the Unified Black Movement, was under heavy surveillance by the SNI, Brazil's intelligence agency. You know, I'm quite sure a lot of people, what does that sound like to you? During the hard years of the dictatorship, the activist Abdias Nascimento went into exile in the United States. He would return in the 1970s and participate in the formation of the Movimento Negro Unificado. So this is Nascimento, who I'm actually talking about today. He actually, because of the hard line of the dictatorship at the time, he was probably more or less afraid of what could happen to him if he continued to push for the open discussion of racism and Black identity politics. So he left the country. He became a professor, like I think it was a university, the New York University in Buffalo, somewhere in there. He stayed there for a few years before he came back to the States, or before he returned to Brazil. There are several organizations who came together to form the Movimento Negro Unificado. You could look at the Grupo Palmares, which came about in the southern city of Porto Alegre. This is actually the group that came up with the idea of celebrating November 20th as the Day of Black Consciousness. So there's little pieces here and there that led to the organization of what would become the Movimento Negro. And this is one of those significant groups. What else do we have here? This is a Tição. It was a magazine, a journal that was released in '78 by the Porto Alegre journalist, Vera Daisy Barcelos. This journal focused on the battle against racial discrimination. And understand, in Brazil, racism was never openly discussed. It was actually something in the law under the dictatorship that actually made it could be interpreted as being illegal that you could discuss racism in Brazil. So along the way, you had several organizations that came up that says, okay, the Black voice needs to be heard. Just a few of them I have listed in this article. You know, several things led to this organization of this movement, right? You know, the banning of, Black players from certain sports clubs, the rampant murder of Black Brazilians by the military police. Numerous incidences over the years led to the formation of the Movimento Negro. Going back to the 1930s, you had Black newspapers, Quilombo, O Clarim de Alvorada. This is José Correia Leite. He was actually part of the Frente Negra Brasileira at the time. This is a protest of the Movimento Negro in downtown Sao Paulo in the late 70s or early 80s. This is intriguing right here. I'm going to cover this article one day because I think in order to get an idea of what the Black rights movements look like in Brazil. But this is something that really caught my attention. This is Carlos Alberto Medeiros. I know him. I consider him to be a really good friend. He's based in Rio de Janeiro. Carlos Alberto is a journalist. He's been covering Black culture, Black movements, Black history in Brazil for probably 50 years now. I last saw him just before I came back to the States back in either August or September of 2021. And Carlos talked about how the lack of Black representation in Brazil's media, Black Brazilians could not find themselves in the media to find people that look like them to which they could see themselves. So when he got a copy of the American Ebony magazine, this opened up his eyes. It was love at first sight for him, because here you had a great magazine, this colorful magazine featuring, beautiful Black people in the United States. And this gave him inspiration to say, hey, we got millions of Black people in this country too that need to see something like this, because at that point, Brazil had indoctrinated its Black population to hate being Black for so long, and seeing something like Ebony in what's considered a racist country, the United States, but yet they had representation in such a magazine, Ebony and Jet. We had other outlets, Black newspapers throughout the United States. So Carlos Alberto talked about how big it was, how much it uplifted his, like self-esteem to see these beautiful Black people on the covers of this Ebony magazine. And so when it popped up in Brazil, he immediately started snatching up copies of Ebony, right? Let me see, who else do we have here? This is the famous activist Lelia Gonzalez. She's considered, one of the greatest Black anthropologists in the country. She's known for being one of the first, well, most widely known Afro-Brazilian feminists at the time. I think Lelia died in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. She didn't, I think she lived, I think she died in 1994. I think it was 1935 to 1994. Even today, people still talk about the importance of Lelia Gonzalez. Her surname is actually Spanish, even though she's Brazilian, because I think she married a guy of Spanish descent. These are some of the founding members of the Movimento Negro Unificado. You got Hamilton Cardoso. I think he committed suicide in the late 70s, early 80s. Then you have Milton Barbosa. Milton Barbosa is still alive and still part of the movement today. This is a cover story talking about, it says here, the Blacks are in the streets, founding member Milton Barbosa is seen, speaking through the bullhorn. This is the 1988 March in memory of 100 years of the abolition of slavery. This was taken by the photo was taken by the famous Januario Garcia, who died, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. 1995 March in the Federal District of Brasilia, the nation's capital, which celebrates 300 years of the death of Zumbi dos Palmares, of which the November 20th Day of Black Consciousness came about. That date was chosen in recognition of the death of Zumbi. So that's just a quick run through of the Movimento Negro. I'm going to get back to the discussion that I initiated about. This is another well-known activist, Magno Cruz of the Centro de Cultura in the state of Maranhão in the Northeast. Okay,